Good morning and welcome everybody to the Center of Addiction and Faith. This is our monthly webinar. Our topic today is addiction, youth, and families. I'm excited that we have three experts in the field to teach us today. I'm also grateful that nearly 200 of you have registered to be here. I'd invite you to, at this moment, click the chat button down below. Tell us your name and where you're from. It's fun to see where everybody's from. My name is Pastor Ed Treat. I am founder and CEO of the Center of Addiction and Faith. The Center of Addiction and Faith is working to awaken faith communities to address addiction. We believe faith communities are well positioned across the country, but are terribly uneducated and unprepared to address the many problems associated with addiction. We want to change that. And as we all emerge from this COVID pandemic, we're all finding addiction and mental health issues going through the roof, and another enormous health crisis that calls for our attention. And I believe our faith communities across the country can play a vital role, but they have some learning to do. So thank you all for being here today and for being a part of the healing that so many need. Let's begin with a moment of silence to think about all those who suffer, followed by the Serenity Prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Our webinar host today is Timothy McMahon King. He's the author of Addiction Nation. He's CEO of Vagabond Consulting and a board member of the Center of Addiction and Faith. He is also the next keynote speaker at the Center of Addiction and Faith conference in October upcoming. In preparation for that conference, Tim is offering a free 6-week series book study on his book, Addiction Nation. You're encouraged to attend and invite members of your faith community and social networks to participate in it. It's a powerful way to prepare your congregation to think about this issue and to address it. So Tim this morning has set up a survey to find out the best way to structure this book study. And Tim, you're looking for some feedback. So you want to, before you introduce our guest today, say just a word about your poll real quick.
Thanks, Ed, and good to be with you all. Should have just seen a little poll pop up on your screen. Just a few questions there. We're trying to gauge interest for doing a book study and also get a sense of how many sessions make the most sense and when to do that during the day. So feel free to go ahead and just drop into that poll and give some feedback there for us. And it is exciting to have this panel today, and partly for me, personal news. My wife and I are expecting our first child in September. And so we're thrilled and excited. And this also brings a whole new level of seriousness to this discussion for me. Because this is now, as someone who has, wrestled with an opioid addiction and is in recovery from that, of needing to think about this on a different level of what if this happens in my family, and knowing that there is also, as a parent, as a future parent, that you can do so much, right? And work and do the best, and that there are still things outside of your control. And one thing that I was not entirely prepared for as I had written my book, Addiction Nation, is one of the first things that happened was the amount of parents who reached out to me asking about what to do with a child who was struggling with substance use, and in some ways that were dangerous, and to hear the concern from parents. And to also know that sometimes that deep love and that deep concern does not always translate into the most effective ways of talking about substance use with a young person, or the healthiest dynamics for that entire family to address substance use and substance use disorders. And so this is where it's exciting to have a few different speakers today to address this topic from different angles and to present different information. And also, one thing that is kind of a recurring theme with some of these webinars is continuing to be in the mindset of understanding that addiction is such a multifaceted, complex issue that what we aren't looking for a silver bullet. We aren't looking for the one solution that will work for every child and every family in every circumstance. We're trying to understand what that tool belt is. What are the variety of approaches and ways that we can understand these dynamics and contributing factors that will be specified then and can be customized and can be applied to a particular situation? And to give some of that hope that if one approach doesn't work immediately, that's actually more of the norm. That's not a failure. That if we think about this like from cancer, we don't blame a cancer patient if chemo doesn't work. We ask, what's the next therapy that we need to try that's going to be specified for that person and what they are struggling with? And that's some of what we hope to present today. And the other fun part with this presentation is our presenters are going to be at the conference in October. And so if this is a conversation that spikes your interest and you want to know more and you want to learn more, there's going to be a great opportunity to follow up and to dive in deeper. So going to go ahead and start off by introducing Dan Gibson, longtime involved in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. He currently serves as the primary counselor for the teen unit at the Thelma McMillan Recovery Center in Torrance. Is it Calgary or just Canada? Sorry, Dan, I'm messing that up. Or California. So my third time I got it right. And he is helping develop some of this youth and family track for the Center of Addiction and Faith and for this conference, and has a long time history working also as a spiritual care director in a variety of capacities with youth and helping with family dynamics. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan for his presentation. Then I'll introduce our next speaker. And at the end, we will have our time for questions in this session, as well as our after webinar, more interactive discussion. So Dan, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Tim. And I also want to give a special welcome to all of you. It's just really cool to be among those who share the same passion that I do on this subject. So thank you for being here. Also, I'm sad to say that I don't have any pictures or slides, but if you can stay awake long enough to get through my presentation, I know that Joy will treat you to something really snappy. All right, so I'm going to start with a brief history. I'm a Southern California native, had a positive experience growing up in a youth ministry in Southern California, St. Timothy Lutheran Church. And as a kid, I was involved with various activities, local school, church, parks and recreation, neighborhood, family activities. And I just noticed there was something qualitatively different from my youth group involvement with those other activities. And they're all good, wholesome, healthy activities, fair play, all that stuff. But I felt genuinely accepted and loved in my youth group setting. I didn't have to compete with anyone else to make the team. I had made it, and I could just be me. And that really impacted me in a very positive way and was instrumental in my realizing my call in youth ministry and provide the same type of space for grace that I had received. So over a 15-year period, I had a very rich and varied experience. I saw the shift from primarily youth ministry going into youth and family ministry. When we'd see the young people coming to church, there was some that would have that that heaviness when they were in the youth hut. And so we started to consider that our work would include working with the entire family, including multi-generational types of settings. Because of my own family history, I developed a passion for addiction recovery and spirituality. I had lost a father and brother from alcoholism. And so, over the years, it had been kind of fermenting within me. And then by the time I became a campus pastor at USC, I finally completed my credential as a chemical dependency counselor, and was asked to help out with the Haven USC, which was an offsite, and is, I believe it's still there, an offsite sober living facility. Doing things from, individual sessions with the students to leading group meditations. And it was great. It was also a volunteer position, and but the campus ministry position was not, and the funds had dried up. And I'm not one who is savvy at fundraising, let alone raising funds with my own salary, but that's another story. I moved on and I persevered, and while doing interim work, I earned my doctorate in spiritual renewal. That's kind of a shorthand version of that title, with a focus on streamlining my passion for addiction recovery and spirituality in both congregational and clinical settings. Eventually landed at the Thelma McMillan Recovery Center in Torrance, California, and was asked to work with, of all areas, was the teens. And I started as a youth director a month after I turned 21, but I wasn't sure if I still had what it takes to work with this population. And as it turns out, I seem to have hit it off rather well with them. About the same time, came into contact with the addiction and faith folk, and they asked me to work with the youth and family track. So here I am. And with that as introduction, I'd like to spend a few minutes on my work with the Thelma McMillan Recovery Center, my experience working specifically with the youth and family. And there's two parts to that. First, there's the family as a group, or groups of families that you would meet with together. And second, there would be the families as the individual unit. So first, there is the family groups. And, I got to tell you that, people don't wake up, whether it be a teen or adult, and stretch their arms in the morning and say, today seems like a wonderful day to join the Thelma McMillan Recovery Center. Or today seems like a wonderful day to join AA. No, usually people get the hell kicked out of them. There are families that get their hearts ripped out. So when a new family comes on board, they feel beaten up. They feel scared to death at the end of the line and at the end of their rope. But I've seen through their openness and their sharing and doing the good work that a miraculous transformation can take place, where the families gain solidarity, strength, and hope. They hear the stories that they can identify with. They hear the similarities rather than the differences. A few weeks ago, I was leading a group, and I'm going to just kind of make this really general, but one of the families, the moms, was expressing how she's going to pull her daughter out of school. It's on a virtual school, but pull her out and put her into another school because she's not sure of the influence. Yet there was, a couple months left of school. And, I didn't think it was such a great idea. And I kind of gently said, well, just that, I think that maybe you ought to think it over. But then what I did is I invited the rest of the families to give their input. And I tell you, when I stepped aside and got myself out of the way, it was amazing what had occurred. The families came together, they bonded, they found a solution. In short, it was decided that she would stay there. It was a good decision, and they would revisit it, moving her around in the fall. So I share that story in this section with you, among other reasons, as to why I think a family panel, which has kind of been my idea for the 3 workshops that we're going to do at the conference, and why I think that would be an effective tool. Secondly, I work with individual families. Upon admission, there's an assessment of the patient's history, their environment, their use, and the effects thereof. And then there is this. There is a covenant or a contract. I call it a covenant. It's my pastor's mind. I think of covenant, but it's called technically a contract, primarily to keep the teen accountable, and lays out the privileges and the consequence. Not instinctively my theological approach, but at least the parents and the teens, they take ownership together. It turns out to be a very effective tool, from previously operating from either ignoring that nothing is going on to screaming and hollering at each other. So when something goes down, and someone had shared this with me not long ago, they said, Dan, instead of letting this situation that, we lost our minds over it, we said, we have this contract. And the family gathered around the contract and said, oh yeah, if something like this happened, then Johnny or Susie would lose their iPhone. And that's what they did. Now, it doesn't always work that cleanly, but I'm finding again and again that having a contract can be a very effective tool. And I know that there's a lot of you out there today from a different setting, so I'm just inviting you to, consider how you can apply that to your situation. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's this focus on the identification and implementation on the family values. What are their core values? Particularly directed at the parents. Do they match your lifestyle? What are the barriers to living in line with your family values that you've identified? Are they shared? Are both, can everybody in the family get on board with them? And one thing I want to mention that I've observed lately is that I'm noticing that some of these families, that they don't even know what their values are. And so it becomes, up to us to help them discover that. And to give a little context to that, from coming out of my pop culture mind, in the 1950s, there was this idealized idea of white suburban life, conformity to social norms. Families appeared to be intact and perfect. There was a, TV shows would resolve themselves in a 30-minute increments, not realistic. In the 1960s, there was the time of disappointment and disillusionment, assassinations, tension in the inner city, conflict going on in Southeast Asia, the emergence of the generation camp. So there was a decline in the family structure and an incline of drug use. Not to mention there was an incline of the divorce rate. So here comes Generation X and the millennials, and they say, forget this. And their reaction to these broken systems and the rising cost of living is they're going to wait later and be more selective about who they tie the knot with. Not to mention, that they want to finish their education first, which is, costs astronomical. So with the rising pressure in technology, it's made relationships increasingly fragmented and impersonal, which is left a deep void. And, of course, the pandemic hasn't helped matters. So again, it's no longer, we need to return to family values, because in many cases, they never had them in the first place. And so hopefully over time, that's one of the things that my colleagues and I have attempt to help them to discover. And then lastly, on a positive note, and I know that, again, that you all come from different ecumenical interfaith groups, so forgive me from sharing from my own faith tradition. I'm a Lutheran Christian, and baptism is at our core. And so I take a baptismal approach. And that's the point when, we gather for a baptism, that the quote contracts, or the covenants, as I call them, are made them. Promises are made on behalf of the parents, the sponsors, the congregation. Those same values that I mentioned earlier that kept me in the church and got me to realize my call in the church: acceptance, grace, love, forgiveness, newness of life. And then, revisiting and looking at that with a fresh lens, if not polishing up the one that we already have. Martin Luther talked about how it is the parents that should be teaching the the catechism. So there was a focus on the family, not dropping off Johnny for confirmation class on a Thursday and expecting the pastor to turn them into a spiritual giant. The pastor, and leaders of the church are supposed to be mentors in the faith. So the question, I kind of want to leave us is, how do we better partner, come alongside our families in our Lutheran Christian history to live out our baptism, not just in the beginning stages of life, but through all stages, through the cradle and the grave, strengthening our ecumenical and interfaith relationships, strengthening our partnerships and coalitions. And Joy and Jan will elaborate and build on that a little bit. There's more talk about the church, existing. We've always talked about it, but people are thinking more and doing more of, being the church outside of the walls, coming alongside and modeling discipleship out in the world and seeing Christ in the face of these, of the least of these.
Thank you, David.
Like addicts, for example. And I just heard somebody say something, so that's it. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks so much, Dan. And reminders, saw this in the comments as well, wanting to make sure that we understand that the Center of Addiction and Faith, there's a lot of different definitions of family, both biological and chosen, and that those family structures are all accepted and welcomed here. And now excited to introduce Joy Gonerman. Joy is also from the ELCA Lutheran Church tradition and began working as a counselor for the Jackson Recovery Centers and the Adolescent Residential Unit, while also serving as a pastor there. And we are excited to have her here. And also as she continues her work to make sure that she removes stigma and shame that surrounds substance and process addictions. She's also on the board of directors of the Siouxland Cares Coalition and on the DEI committee for the Rosecrans Jackson Centers. Joy, I'll let you go ahead and take it away with your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Very glad to be here today, and Dan did a great job of a segue kind of into what I'm going to be talking about. So yes, I am ordained in the ELCA, and I am fortunate that my synod considers my work at Rosecrans to be my rostered call. So I get kind of the best of both worlds. So prevention, there's a lot of stuff that has to go with prevention, but it's actually, there's a science to it. And the science to it is something that community can really participate in. So I know that the Centers for Addiction and Faith started as a sort of a support group for clergy and other people of faith that are in recovery. And that, of course, is one of the great services that churches do. They provide a space, for example, 12-step programs and a space within their community. But we talk about something in prevention, and I'm sure you've heard of this before too, about upstream, working upstream. And prevention then, I like to tell people, my goal would be to teach myself how to work, right? My goal would be to accomplish prevention community-wide to such a point that I would no longer be necessary. And in that way, then recovery would no longer be necessary, right? So we would be educating people and preventing substance use or process disorders. So one of the things I was thinking about when thinking about talking to you was that congregations are always trying to figure out how to be relevant. Well, here's a great way to be relevant, because everybody knows somebody that suffers from substance use disorder. You may not just know it. Perhaps it is a family member that suffers that way, and they're in our pews, They're sitting next to us at the coffee shop. They are around. And you know the text from Matthew 25, we'll get to that in a minute, but I think communities of faith are called to community wellness. And of course, when we talk about prevention work, we're talking about public health. We're talking about the community good. So this is a brief introduction to what prevention is. And I'll be presenting at the fall conference, but it's just an idea to kind of whet your appetite about what this actually means. So this is just me. I'm a certified prevention specialist, international gaming disorder certified as well. So in the chat, I invited you to put onto your phones this Menti. You don't have to download anything, just go to menti.com. And I'd like you to put in this code, which is up here at the top, 90936636, and answer this question: what is addiction? I have no idea how many people are on this site or on this call. Make sure we have it refreshed. Notice I have coffee there. That's one of those that that many of us like. Okay, page 11. I think we have some informed people, which is very exciting. Tim or Ed, do we know how many people are on the webinar? So I know how many people to wait for.
We have about 50 people live, but we also will have a lot of folks on their phones or might not be able to hop over to the site.
Okay, okay. Give it a couple more minutes. Boing, 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 boing. All right. I think we're getting a good idea then. So I'm glad to see that nobody selected character flaw. Yay. Really glad to see no one selected a moral failing. A rite of passage. Good. Sometimes we get confused about the difference between addiction and getting drunk, two different things. We have some that consider it an obsession and some that consider it, the majority, of course, consider it then a medical condition. So I'm glad we're on the right page here. Addiction is in fact a disease. It is a disease. We consider it, first it starts off as a lifestyle disease, like heart disease, for example, right? So it is a disease, so it's a condition with a recognizable set of symptoms, a course of progression, and identified best practices for treatment. So that's the definition of a disease, right? Now there's two kinds of diseases. There's acute and chronic, right? Acute would be appendicitis. You take out the appendix, it's better, right? Chronic, however, is where addiction falls. Same place as Parkinson's, same place as Alzheimer's, same place as arthritis. It is a new normal. And so we understand addiction as a disease of the brain, because the brain's chemistry actually changes. Now, when you look behind me, you can see that I'm in my studio and I've got some yarn back there. I love knitting. I knit a lot. The difference, though, between addiction and an obsession is that for an addiction, if I was addicted to knitting, I would not be able to sit here and just look at this yarn behind me without doing something about it, all right? My brain would take over and it would demand that I put everything else aside and go for that yarn. So we understand addiction different as an obsession. It actually is a change in the brain's chemistry. It's not a choice, all right? Once the brain's chemistry is changed, addiction is no longer a choice. It is just the way your brain functions. And addiction is not curable, but it is treatable, all right? We can't cure addiction. We can live in recovery. We can treat the disease. So when we understand addiction and as a disease, it is a primary progressive chronic disease that affects the whole person physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And we understand spiritually, in this context, we understand it as who you believe you are. Who do you believe you are in the world? Why do you think you're here? What do you have to contribute to the world? It affects the entire family system. And this is where communities of faith can really step in. It's a disease that, if left untreated, will eventually lead to death. Addiction ends either in death or in recovery. So my work in prevention, right, focuses on interventions that occur prior to the onset of a disorder and which are intended to prevent the occurrence of the disorder or reduce the risk for the disorder. It also optimizes well-being. And we're going to talk really briefly about resiliencies and trauma. But this is essentially prevention, right? Helping something before it starts. Because once the brain is altered as a brain that is now an addicted brain, prevention, of course, is past. So we talk about this, what we call continuum of care in prevention. Promotion is just essentially talking about it, getting it out of the shadows, speaking about it. One of the things I get to do, because I work at Rosecrans Jackson Centers during the week, I am free to do pulpit supply. And so I get to go out and I get to preach about addiction from the pulpit. The first funeral I ever did was for a person who committed suicide at the church that I served. And being fresh out of seminary, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to talk about suicide from the pulpit, silly me. And remarkably, people thanked me for being able to do that, being able to take something that is painful and hard and harsh and has been stigmatized and speak about it publicly, remove the stigma. So promotion has to do with that. Then in prevention, we talk about these particular sorts of populations. Universal would be just your general population, just everybody that just walks around, right? General universal population. Selective has to do with a particular group of people who may be at higher risk. For example, I'm in the juvenile detention system every week. Kids that are in the juvenile detention system are a select group of people who may be at higher risk for substance use or process disorders. People that have experienced trauma, historical trauma, something that they bear in their genes, right? People of color, our native populations, are a selective group that may be at higher risk. People that have experienced combat are a selective group of people that are at higher risk. Indicated speaks to people that have already experienced some use, right? So one of the things we do in prevention is we do what's called a diversions class. So if a kid has a DUI, if a kid has a possession charge, then they get to spend 8 hours with us in an evidence-based program that talks specifically to what they have used and to the health risks. Not to shame them. We don't do the DARE program so much. We don't scare them about it. We actually give them information, science, right? Evidence, so that they can at least make informed decisions, right? So this is the population that I work with in prevention. Treatment, of course, is once a person has started using and has their brain chemistry has changed, and recovery is where people live once they have had treatment. So the continuum of care. Now, this is an interesting continuum of care when you talk about communities of faith as well. And Dan talked on this, right? So we talk about cradle to grave. We talk about the continuum of care with human beings that inhabit our pews, that inhabit our communities, that are our neighbors. And so when we look at them, what do they need in the continuum of care? So here's another question for you on your Menti, same code. So true or false, 70% of those who live with substance use disorders started in their teens. What do you think? See if I can get this one to work here. I'm so proud of myself. I figured out this Mentimeter thing. That way you guys, I know that you're there. That's cool.
Joy, could you throw that code back in the chat page real quick? Is that possible?
You bet. It is, and find my chat. So the code is to everybody, hang on. Everyone. It's 9093 6636. Okay, getting a lot of answers in here. I think I know. I think I know who those two people are. Anybody else waiting to answer? Okay, in the interest of time, we'll move on. The answer is false. The correct answer is 90%. 90% of people that suffer from substance use disorder started using in their teens. Interesting, right? So churches are constantly figuring out, how can we be relevant to our youth? How can we be useful to our youth? What might we offer to our youth that will make them feel the church is relevant in their lives? So the reason that youth are higher at risk for developing substance use disorders because their brains are not yet fully developed. The prefrontal cortex, the part of their brain that tells them to stop doing something that they enjoy doing, this part of their brain is not fully developed until they're 25, 26, 27 years old. And so the earlier somebody has a positive experience, the more likely they are to try it again. So thinking of alternative activities, things for kids to do that don't involve using substances is something a church can actually do. And the longer kids can put off using for the very first time, the more likely they are to be able to engage their prefrontal cortex, even if they're having fun, and say, this is a bad idea. If you ask a high school kid how they know they've had too much to drink, their first answer is usually, I throw up. Now, most of us would say that's way beyond, right? And physically it is. But that's just because their prefrontal cortex doesn't tell them to stop doing something until it becomes unpleasant. So I'm not going to go through the whole strategic prevention framework with you because we'll talk about this more at the conference. But this is the science behind prevention work in the community. And we have these petals, right? So we have assessment, we have capacity, planning, implementation, and evaluation. The center of all of these petals to prevention is sustainability, meaning is it something that will continue in the community? Is it something that can be done, say, for example, after our grant is finished, right? And then also cultural competence, and that's important. So when we talk about capacity, the definition here is, does the community have the capacity to continue the work after grant funding ends? Again, faith communities are always figuring out how can we be relevant in a community. So here's an opportunity for people to think about relevancy, to think about the point of being in a community as a community of faith and continue work that is highly important. And here are the sectors that science says must be useful in, for example, coalitions. And you notice that one of these is faith communities. Faith communities can participate in coalitions along with all these other sectors, but faith communities are often lacking in coalitions. Sustainability is another one of these petals. Essentially, what do we do with our budgets at church? How do we make use of the money that is given to our church? How do we make use of the building? Now that we are learning in COVID that we can do worship differently, maybe we don't need a big building. Maybe we can use that building as a part, as offering for sustainability. We talk about cultural competence. The newer phrases are cultural humility and cultural curiosity. In other words, we work with diverse communities, and we need to assure them that we want to hear what they need. Sometimes it means just shutting up and listening. For example, here in Sioux City, we have a large Native population, so we don't demonize tobacco. We talk about the risks of nicotine. We talk about that, but our Native communities understand tobacco as something different, as something sacred. So demonizing it ostracizes an entire population of people. So when we look at Matthew 25, which most of you all know, you can look it up if you like, speaks about seeing Christ in the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. Addiction may lead any or all to these conditions. So if we're going to be relevant in communities, we can recognize that Matthew 25 doesn't only apply to the past, doesn't only apply to scripture. It applies to those that are sitting in our pews and those that occupy our communities. So last thing here, before I hand it over, this is a text from Romans. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the wrong I do not want is what I do. For those of you that are in recovery, does this not sound like addiction? So for Richard Rohr, he helps us sort of frame this in a different way. Richard Rohr has a great book, Breathing Underwater. He wants to frame it this way. Our sin is our addiction. Addiction is not a sin. And if congregations can help frame this in their communities, we have a relevancy, and we can work with those that need help before they start to enter into addiction. So we talk about resilience building. Research says just one caring, safe relationship early in life gives any child a much better chance at growing up healthy. What better mission is there for people in communities of faith than to be a caring, safe relationship for a person that's at risk for substance use disorder? So I think communities of faith have a lot to offer. That's what I've got for you today.
Thank you so much, Joy. And see in the chat, we are looking at time. And Jan, if you wouldn't mind going ahead, if this is okay with you, I'd love to have you just respond for a few minutes to the presentation so far. And then possibly, I think we'd love to get into more of Jan's work in some future webinars. And Jan, could you kick us off with some important things and highlights that you'd be able to respond to for us? And then we'll also be able to jump into this more in the discussion.
Sure.
And Jan, brief introduction, is the director and founder of the Spirit Works Foundation. And that their mission is to educate, equip, empower, and celebrate individuals, families, and communities on the journey from addiction to recovery, and is also an expert in implementing peer support. And so Jan, excited to have a taste of what you have today, and we'll be looking forward to diving into it more in the future.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me. And it's been really nice to listen to both Dan and Joy from their frameworks and perspectives, and shared a lot of really good information in terms of the prevention piece. There's lots of things that we are working on these days in terms of prevention, looking at certainly preventing the use in the first place, preventing misuse once somebody may or may not have started, preventing overdose death, and for those who are already in recovery, preventing what we call return to use. And so there's a great deal of work that is being done. And, absolutely to Joy and Joy's work, the further upstream we can go, the better. As she mentioned, and as we know, individuals, families, and communities' lives are deeply challenged by our inability to prevent misuse. And then particularly looking at children. I mean, one of the things that we know is that, a child's brain is not fully formed until they're 25 years old. And so, much like she talked about the structure being changed and the chemistry being changed, the longer we can get someone to say no, the better, and the more of an opportunity their frontal lobes will come online, and they will actually also be able to participate in making good choices for themselves. Just thinking too, and listening to Dan, and I think one of the things that really stood out for me is making a covenant or a promise. Somewhat of a contract, and recognizing too that there are multiple pathways to recovery. There's multiple pathways of recovery, and really knowing and being able to explore that until you find the one that works. And so that too is very significant. When one of the things that I've been working with is an approach called the Invitation to Change approach. And it really builds on the work that both of them were describing. It takes the craft, community reinforcement, and family training, as well as motivational interviewing and acceptance and commitment therapy. And between those three, it really allows people to understand better, really recognize that our behaviors make sense. We often talk about if somebody was going to touch a hot stove, we would instantly remove our hands from that. And yet we see, and certainly Dan sees in the work that he does, many people doing what would be akin to touching a hot stove, and yet they do it anyway. And because they do it anyways, it means that to them, that behavior makes sense. And so just being able to really acknowledge and pick up some of those pieces. I've seen a lot of folks respond in the chat around that term family values. And I'm going to stay away from the word family values. What I do know from this work is that it's very important for individuals, families, to have some values. And so, for all of us who are certainly on the panel, but I would imagine most of you, if not all of you on the call, are here because we know a thing about values. For us, it could be our Christian values. For others, it could be truly their family values. We also know that a lot of children and youth pay attention to, the peer values. And so, as a faith community, being able to point people within the body of Christ, within the body of whatever our particular religious tradition is, our faith tradition, to something that is going to be healthy, to promote wellness, healing, wholeness, sustainability, and those things. And so, really great foundations. And I appreciate both Dan and Joy, and appreciate the opportunity to say a few words and to kind of hopefully contextualize some of what they were talking about. And I'm here to answer any questions when it's time. And Ed and Tim, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And again, apologies on time. And one other piece I wanted to be sure to ask you, if that's all right, is your program does do a lot of peer-to-peer support work. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the 12-step tradition, peer-to-peer support with sponsors. Could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
So the primary difference is that 12-step is a particular pathway. And so, yes, 12-step programs use sponsors, they use 12 steps. And then beyond that, there are many other pathways, for those who the Native American tradition. There's the Wellbriety movement, which is based on the 12 steps, but it adds in their culture and their tradition and practices. Certainly there's Celebrate Recovery, which is also a Christian-based recovery program, and it uses steps as well as the Beatitudes. But then there are also secular-based programs of recovery. Smart Recovery is one, and it's much more of a cognitive-based recovery path than, and for them, it's kind of, spirituality, faith neutral, such that, it's not a part of people's recovery, but they are also not opposed to people having a religious tradition or a faith experience. So I think one of the things that we've discovered is that it's important for us to help somebody find whatever their chosen pathway is going to be, and then support them in staying on it. And our role as faith leaders and members of faith traditions is to use the love of God in supporting them and not giving up on them. And, as Joy mentioned, Matthew 25. And so we don't have to push or insist that someone participate in a mutual support group that looks like 12 steps. Some people also have natural recovery, and certainly for the sake of time, that could be a whole presentation. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, and Jan, it's been great to get to know your voice through this process. And I think we've got, we'll follow up with you to make sure we schedule the next webinar and get to feature more of this information directly. Ed, I saw you had some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I had my mouse froze for a minute there, and I thought, oh, I can't close up here, but it started working. So thanks be to God. I just have some closing comments to make. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for you, Tim, and thanks for Dan and Joy and Jan. Thank you for the work that you do in this field and the lives that you touch. We're so grateful for people like you who are addressing this problem and helping us to try to spread that help out to a wider community. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to let you know next month, June 25th, our webinar is Addiction, Grief, and Loss, helping people deal with the loss of losing someone from addiction is a terrible loss because it's so unnecessary, but then it doesn't get really dealt with well in our community. And so people get stuck in their grief, and it's helpful for churches, faith communities to understand how to deal with that. So I hope you plan to attend. There is a registration link on there. It's already set up. You can go and register for it. It's Addiction, Grief, and Loss. We have some great guests coming to speak, and we'll offer tools on how to deal with that and how to care for folks going through that. Along with these webinars, the Center of Addiction and Faith offers many helpful resources. We have our annual conference coming up October 7th, 8th, and 9th. It's a hybrid event. You can come in person or virtually. We're bringing together today's best, brightest scholars, theologians, speakers, authors, scholars, practitioners, people with tools in the field of addiction studies. That conference link is also in your chat page if you're interested in finding out more about it, some of the details. And then just so you know, twice a month, we have a new podcast telling the story about clergy impacted by addiction and found recovery. The stories are incredibly inspirational and spiritual. We have a growing number of online 12-step recovery and support groups, some just for clergy. We have training events to develop addiction ministry programs in your congregation. If you're interested in those, let us know. We support advocacy work. We're developing online education for understanding addiction in the context of doing ministry. We offer daily devotions. And I think probably the best thing I could give you today is our app, our free app, smartphone app. It's in your app store for free. Look for Center of Addiction and Faith. It has all our webinars, has all our podcasts. It has all our links right there at your fingertips. It's a great tool, especially for faith leaders. There's one very powerful link in there that will help you find not just addiction treatment for specific addictions in your community, but also mental health supports as well. So a very great tool that'll drill down to the very help you need locally, where you are, anywhere in the country. We do need your help to make all these things happen and keep it going. We welcome your partnerships. We invite you to join us in this work with your financial support. I would ask that you consider making a generous one-time gift or an ongoing sustaining gift to keep our work going. Please go to the link in your chat page, addictionandfaith.com, click on the donate button and help us as we help others. That link is also in your chat page there. We have a Zoom meeting following this for Q&A for those who would like to stick around and talk to the presenters in person. That link is here. You need to grab it now if you're planning to come, because once I close this meeting, that link will disappear. So look for the link that says,
I've dropped it in there, Ed.
Tim has dropped
Post-webinar discussion link.
post-webinar discussion link. So thank you. Copy and paste that into your browser as soon as we're done here. And if you have questions about the book study Tim is planning, I've dropped his email in there as well. He'd love to get your feedback, ideas, suggestions. This is the first time we've tried anything like this. We think it's a great idea, and we hope you do too. And use it as a tool to introduce your congregation. People love book studies, so great way to introduce your congregation to the topic. But that's all I have. Thank you all again for being here. This is such an important topic, and I'm so grateful to have such amazing people, colleagues that do this work with me. God bless you. May the Lord's face shine on you and be gracious to you, look upon you with favor, and give you peace always in the name of Christ. Amen. Go in peace, serve the Lord.
Okay, we will.
Okay, we will.